Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a sunny and breezy April 1st, April Fool's Day. So it's been a while since my last chapter, but if you'll remember, we're on the sexual three, whose keyword is attractiveness. So I actually recorded this one a few weeks ago and didn't feel great about the recording. I kind of rushed my way through it and I realized we're back to, we're at the final number, the three. We started the four because I'm a four. And it kind of like snuck up on me, but, we're back in my neighborhood. And the sexual subtype and the self-preservation subtype, these are the subtypes that I find myself connecting with more deeply. So I realized, gosh, I think I probably kind of breezed through this chapter in a way to avoid my own inner stuff. So I'm going to do another pass. I'm going to be a little bit more connected with what's happening inside me as I read it. It is a super long chapter. So that's part of the problem. And so I'm going to do my best to navigate this. But let's hear what Claudio Naranjo has to say about the sexual three. For the passion of the sexual three, Ichazo used the words masculinity or femininity, depending on the case. I used to explain it as an excessive attempt to conform to cultural images, perhaps Hollywood style, of what it means to be masculine or feminine. Nowadays, he says, I believe that the fundamental pathology of these individuals lies in the fact that instead of acting from instinctive freedom, they invest all their passion into the thirst for love and the corresponding seduction, either through compliance or by projecting an image that is meant to be attractive and exciting. The result of this is that a woman, being overly focused on pleasing a man, loses her ability to enjoy herself. Additionally, this personality type tends to have a certain passion for family, which, while it does not appear as a flaw, represents an exaggerated need to please others, perpetuating self-alienation. Among the three subtypes, the sexual three is the most dependent. They do not usually display aggression and cannot tolerate rejection. Their seduction is aimed at being embraced and validated, confusing their self-worth with the attractiveness of their body. So that's the introduction. And we have Lorena Garcia de las Bayonas, beautiful name, with the transformation in the sexual type 3. So before we dive into it, I really like what Naranjo describes as his own evolution. Like when I think about his starting place for the sexual three, well, the person who comes to my mind is Don Draper from Mad Men. And I'm watching Mad Men now. And so, you have this masculine, attractive, mysterious type. He himself has reinvented himself, right? So there's that mask-like quality that we typically associate with the sort of more available words for the three. The three can be chameleonic, the three can be political, the three can be focused on success and progress. So all that sort of Don Draper energy is there. And Don Draper certainly conforms to the cultural images of what it means to be masculine. But I like how Naranjo gets even more specific, which is that their passion is to be what is desirable from the opposite sex. So to make yourself into something that is pleasurable, pleasing, desirable to the opposite sex is the passion. So it's not just Clint Eastwood. It's Clint Eastwood if and only if that is known to be what women want. And we'll have a woman's perspective for the sexual three, so we'll hear a lot more about that. You can imagine that sexual threes will be different for men and women because men and women want different things. And I guess I'll say a little bit more before we get into the chapter, which is that the core types, 3, 6, and 9, are for me the most difficult types to work with, the energies of them. And in part, that's because they're more pure energies. We've talked about the 6. The 6 is the passion of fear. and who can't relate to fear. Right? I mean, fear is so basic of a human mechanism. 9 is trickier in some ways. I think 9s are perhaps easier to type, but the 9 passion of sloth or indolence or numbing, self-forgetting. Again, we all have profound amounts of sort of self-forgetting. Very few of us are, really in contact with what we want, what we're about, what we're on earth to do. So self-forgetting is sort of this universal human condition. And then 3, desirability, mask, falsity, covering up, with deceit, a sort of profound emptiness. Again, we all have that. I mean, we all look in the mirror every morning, many of us do, and dress up according to some idea of what somebody wants. But I think the 3 in particular is hard for me as a 4, and this is something that is useful to know about Naranjo. I don't think Naranjo really talked about the wings much. Wings have taken off in kind of the popular framing of the Enneagram. But Naranjo really was concerned with the core types and then looked at the other types as sort of stemming from the, so you're basically a 3, 6, or 9. And so a 4 is a 3, a 2 is a 3. You're just a kind of 3. And so the 3 is sort of continually preoccupied with image. And the 2 has found a way to have a positive self-image. And that comes with their own issues. The 4 has found a way to have a negative self-image, and that comes with their issues. And so that would be a kind of a brief way of Naranjo describing things. So it's interesting. One of the names I played with when I was thinking about maybe starting a publication just for this was 4-wing 5. And there are a lot of people who identify as 4-wing 5. And Richard Rohr has talked about that chasm between the 4 and the 5 as the hardest to cross. So there's sort of a little bit of mystique around a 4-wing 5 right at the bottom, the 6 o'clock of the Enneagram. But if Naranjo were here, he might say that's not really a thing, 4-wing 5. A 4 is much closer to 3 than they are to 5. And I think that's interesting to play with for myself and for other 4s potentially, because nobody wants to be a 3, really. 3s get kind of hard. They kind of get put through it a little bit in the Enneagram. Again, because they have this fundamental, sort of almost universal human thing of having an image. And so it's easier for a 4, I think, to take their authenticity and their creativity into the 5 space of like this genius area. It's in a way easier for us to hang out in that space. I'm not just creative, I'm also a hermit. And of course there can be truth to that, but I think it's healthy for any 4 to explore their 3-ness. And I think it's probably hard for a 4 to do that. And it might be the same with 5s. 5s might be drawn to the 4-ness. I'm not just a hermit, I'm also a creative artist. But for 5 to actually touch the fear underneath that feeling of maybe emptiness or solitude, oh yeah, there's fear there. That's probably juicy terrain for a 5. So I'm glad I didn't call this 4-wing 5, because I would have at this point said I've made a terrible mistake. Okay, let's get into The Transformation of the Sexual Type 3 by Lorena Garcia de las Bayonas, and we will try to breeze through this while hitting the key points. So she thanks a bunch of individuals. She writes, as a sexual 3 approaches character healing, they become free to be, to feel, and to express themselves authentically without being imprisoned by the beautiful physical image, being able even to be ugly and show the ugliness of their life, such as pain, anger, sadness, jealousy, envy, resentment, and everything they consider shameful or that makes them lose control. So right off the bat, we're talking about freedom and spontaneity, and 3s are one of the easier ways to spot a 3 or differentiate a 3 from other types is threes are a little held in. It's like a 3 has to pass through an image filter before doing something. They're the most image conscious, and so freedom, the freedom to be, to feel, to express, isn't there for the 3. So as this is helpful for me, was when I'm doing my self-typing, self-preservation 4 has always been the one that spoke most clearly to me. But a self-preservation 4 has that in common with the 3, right? The self-preservation 4 has to be contained. And containment is something that the 3 and the 4, the sexual 3 and the self-preservation 4 share here. Now, the reasons for containment are different, and we'll explore that as we get into it. In this way, they're free to be able to make mistakes without the fear that they will stop being loved. They also leave behind the dependence on approval and love from others, especially from a partner, which results from a lack of self-love. What remains is more real sense of self-love, through which they can feel a greater warmth inside after passing through the hell of breaking through the internal numbness and the inability to love. So for the 3, the self-abandonment is profound and prevalent here. The 3 has sort of made this bargain early on to treat the image of themselves as their real self. And they don't know that they've made that bargain, or it's not available to them. So in contrast, the 4 has this unlovability. The 4 has the presence of being unlovable. The 3 has the absence of being lovable. For the sexual 3, if my partner isn't validating me, then that's terrifying. And I think it's even more, it's not that I'll feel bad, it's like I'm without ground. Whereas the 4 might say, if my partner leaves me, like, I knew I was bad. I knew all along they would leave me. They don't like me, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, for the 4, the threat of separation is a confirmation of some deeply held negative belief. For the 3, then they touch emptiness. They touch not knowing what I am, who I am, if I am not pleasing to this person. Quote, I understand how my ego is destroying me and preventing me from finding love. Now, at this stage of my life, love is about all the love I can feel for myself, truly knowing myself and considering myself. That is where everything begins to be more real. Love is not a goal, nor a task, nor an achievement, nor a conquest. When a sexual 3 heals, they also appear more relaxed and carefree. They let go of the compulsion to do things, to have everything under control, and to be loved. With their gaze turned inward rather than outward, they can see the difference between what they truly feel and need and self-deception. In this way, they become stronger and more mature, and the sensation of fragility disappears, the kind that makes people say, better not touch them, they might break. They also become more independent, knowing they can survive, sometimes even better, without a partner, feeling loved and valued for who they are, not for what they do. That might be a way to disambiguate between a sexual 3 and a self-preservation 4. The work that I'm doing in this document is, I don't know if my gaze is that turned outward. Like, to some extent it is, for sure. I would say that yeah, I think I'm much more inward focused. I certainly do and act and feel and think ways that are according to, masculinity. And when I think about masculinity, what does masculinity mean to me? It's super heterosexually motivated. Being a man, being masculine to my structure is being the things that a woman needs, which is different. An 8, their masculinity can be about power and autonomy and strength. Same thing with a 6, potentially a sexual 6. For me, my sense of masculinity is deeply tied in to meeting the needs of the feminine, of a woman. That said, the conclusion there still feels a lot more like a self-preservation 4. It still feels a lot more like containment and self-suppression rather than feeling a certain way. But they're, opening doors, paying for dinner. There's like a whole set of things that I do automatically or did automatically when I was dating. Now I just slammed the door in my wife's face. No, those were image conscious. I just don't know if they were that, like, I wasn't doing a lot of this sort of outward gaze, I don't think. It's interesting to spend more time with that. Healing also involves finding the freedom to enjoy sex without merely being an object for the other's pleasure, being able to let go of control and be less focused on their image, which does not allow them to feel pleasure and in many cases reach orgasm. Yeah, so like a sexual 3, I'm going to speak from the heterosexual man's point of view, that's about my sense of worth is wrapped up in the woman's pleasure. My potency is the woman's orgasm. In my own sexual experience, it's just like not, again, almost 9, right? Like just forgotten. Remember the 9 and the 6 and the 3, that core triad, they have so much in common. I think 9s, 6s, and 3s move into each other with a lot more fluidity than the other connected types. So the 3, in being so preoccupied with image, of course, forgets themselves. The sexual 3 woman, in the process of healing, sees herself learning to live without the need for the gaze and recognition of a man. And of course, for a woman, our culture is so much more conducive to 3ness. For a man, she adds, it would similarly involve the need for the gaze of a woman, a childish and narcissistic need for constant applause, which leaves him increasingly empty because his romantic relationships are based on doing things so that the other applauds him. So much of these relational needs end up becoming transactional. So I need the love of a woman, but in that need for reinforcement and confirmation, we both end up sort of losing our true erotic connection, right? On my end, I sort of regress into a childish need for applause. On her end, she sort of shuts down into like, great job, honey. And nobody is actually getting what they want. Many times, she adds, achieving that applause becomes very difficult, leading to great frustration that results in a permanent state of unhappiness in their romantic life. So we're talking about, she says, becoming aware of self-deception and falseness in romantic relationships. Self-deception and falsity being the core passions and fixations of the 3. Unmasking the image of being good and perfect in order to be loved and realizing their difficulty in truly loving represents one of the greatest shadows for the sexual 3, as they have always believed they had a great capacity to love. Yeah, and that's painful. That's really hard. I'm going to skip over some of these quotations from a book. She writes about entering the therapeutic process for the sexual 3. Remember, a lot of these writers are psychotherapists, so this is heavy on the therapy side here. So, she talks about why might a 3 start therapy or a sexual 3 start therapy. She says, if a sexual 3 looks inward even slightly, they will realize they feel a sadness that has always been there. Reminds me of the 5. If the 5 looks inward even slightly, they will realize an emptiness that has always been there. And for a 3, they'll feel a sadness that has always been there. And for a 4 in the middle, you'll probably get a mix of sad and empty. So there's that polarization between the 3 and the 5. I think that's another way to disambiguate. The 3 is a polarization between the 2 and the 4. So the 3 is bringing in more of that other centricity that a 2 has, that attunement to need. The 4 really is a bit more self-absorbed. So the 4 is caught between the inner emptiness and the inner sadness. So what do they do with the sadness? What happens is that by not expressing it and being constantly preoccupied with not showing it, they don't even reveal it to themselves. So why might the 3 start therapy? Someone they admire might, that's kind of snarky, but she says, the motivation that a sexual 3 finds to begin therapy is initially related to the fact that someone they admire has spoken to them about the benefits of the process and has told them they might need it. A sexual 3 might also come to realize they had a difficult life. I say realize because perhaps they have been disconnected from their personal tragedy. I think that I can connect to that. There's 3s may not really be in touch with what they didn't get. And then they share something about their life or childhood, and someone reflects back to them the tragic nature of their experience. Another reason she says is the trendiness of the therapeutic world. Rarely, her point is, the motivation comes from a feeling of true need for transformation. That takes time to develop because the 3, or the sexual 3 specifically, feels this deep disconnection to their experience. They'd have to let the mask slip. Perhaps they might feel like a very fragile and sad person, or they might not show that, or they might embellish it to use it as a seduction tool. Where they may clearly feel the need for introspection is usually after a breakup. In that case, they will connect with a primitive pain related to reliving an abandonment by their father or mother. For sexual 3, a breakup is their worst nightmare, better than die to separate, they seem to think, or they imagine that is the closest thing to death. I don't know how common that is, but I certainly relate to that. Like, it took me a while to be able to accept the prospect of the end of a relationship as kind of like a normal thing. For me, it was always existential, always like a death, and something that I almost couldn't look at. Not so much because of fear of being abandoned or fear of being alone, but like that primal fear of like, what am I if not in a relationship? Not even that conscious thought, but just sort of almost an incapacity. And I certainly have had times in my life where alone, even if my partner is just away for a while, I kind of just like fall into this really kind of crude way of being, not taking care of myself, things like that. And again, I don't know how much of this, maybe that's men. I'm not sure. But here in the sexual 3, I think that feels like that's part of the energy. When facing a breakup, they may even have suicidal thoughts, start using drugs to drown out their suffering. They're terribly afraid of pain. And when they enter it, it feels like they will never come out no matter how many times they've been in and out of it before. That's tricky for the 4, right? Because the 4 is a friend of pain. Although the 4 has turned pain into a story. And so the 4 also, their pain, their drama sometimes is their protective device against even deeper pain. It's one of the worst survival strategies in the Enneagram, I think, for the 4. The 4 is like, let me feel a lot of pain so that I don't actually have to feel the real pain. People, quotations, point being life revolving around romantic relationships. A sexual 3 feels and lives in a permanent prison. They feel suffocated by vanity, and this suffocation leads them to want to remain unnoticed and to be extremely shy, afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. The need to free themselves from this is another motivation that might lead them to therapy. So this prison is, on the one hand, the need to always be pleasing to the other. Again, not pleasing in the supplicatory way of the 2, not like submissive pleasing or sexual pleasing. It's more like a full identity complementing, like it's a performance. It's masterful performance of, I give you exactly what you need. So there's power there. There's less of like an insecurity, or at least a conscious insecurity. So that takes a huge amount of energy, which is suffocating, which then they want to remain unnoticed and be extremely shy. That's interesting. We haven't really heard much about the shyness of the 3. But it makes sense. You would want to be almost in a place where you're completely alone, which is maybe familiar to the 3, that not being noticed, essentially. I'm either on stage or nobody's noticing me. That's kind of an interesting polarity for the 3 to explore. What is left behind? In the process of transformation, emotional, sexual, and physical disconnection is left behind. The fear of real intimacy, the dependency on love, the self-deception around love, the thirst for loving and being loved, superficiality, compulsion to put all energy into seduction, conquest, and pleasing the other, the dependence on recognition and applause in romantic relationship. The fear of confrontation is also left behind, as well as the self-deception that comes with the stories one tells oneself to avoid confrontation. You can hear the 9 in that. Finally, the sexual 3 dares to experience conflict and sustain it, something so feared and difficult for them. Therapeutic recommendations. Yeah, just stepping away from seduction, stepping away from image. And the therapist, these are, recommendations to a therapist that she's giving here is the therapist has to be aware of this seductive performance that the 3 will put on. And with self-deception and seduction, there's also the danger that the patient will end up taking control of the therapy and will not surrender to the process, seeing the same relational patterns repeating, feeling like an object, only seen for the term. See, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like the 3 takes control. That's the Mad Men, Don Draper assertiveness piece, I think. Even the feminine side of that, which may be more submissive in some ways, there's still a controlling that's very important for the 3. I control the experience. And by controlling the experience, I feel like I have power. I feel like I have freedom. I feel like I know what's really going on, but in fact, it's the opposite. There's no freedom. It's a highly contained experience. There's no spontaneity. There's not seeing what's really going on because there's disconnection from one's interior. And you're not in contact with the other. So once they get past all this, she writes, the sexual 3 will connect with the void of not knowing who they are outside of another person. That's huge. Connect with the void of not knowing who you are outside of another person. That's kind of like the basic work, I think, for the 3 energy. 3s, if you work with the 3, getting them to write about what they want in a way that's just for them, not a blog post, not an announcement. It's very difficult. A lot of things come out of the 3 like PR. Once they pass through that emptiness, then they can begin to see the self-deception they've lived in all their life. So there's seduction and self-deception. Moving through that, then there's this void of really not knowing what I am. And then spending time in that void, like a baby learning to crawl, like, well, what do I want? What do I care about? What's real to me? Then, but just by seeing how hard that is for themselves, then they kind of come face to face with their self-deception and how it's driven their life. And it's so hard for a 3 because the 3 is successful. The 3 is good looking. The 3 has it all. The 3 has great relationships. Typically, I'm super generalizing, but contrast that to the 4, the neighbor. 4 is like come beating down the doors on therapy because something, they're really having a tough time. So the 4 comes saying, I want to transform. So interesting. They're very different that way. And they have so much in common, but the 4 is certainly more in contact with that emptiness. But the 4 is tricky because the 4 can turn anything into a story really fast, including that emptiness. The 3 is the same way. The 4 turns it into a story of art and of drama and of it's aesthetically beautiful. That's how the 4 stays. I'm talking really subtle layers now, but like the 4, even at the deepest levels of experience can turn that into art. And it can be wonderful art, but that instinct oftentimes comes from still a need to be authentic and need to be special, to avoid, let's say, generic feelings of abandonment and hurt. Anything but generic, right? The 3, I think, as we'll see maybe later in this chapter, and I think we saw in the previous one, the 3 will touch that and then turn it into a success story, turn it into a turnaround, turn it into a hero's journey. Gosh, I hit bottom and then I made it great. So they both have that fast kind of reconstituting structure quality. They may realize their entire life has been a great lie they constructed out of hunger for love and admiration. These are hard things to say, but this is from a 3. And 3s are, I think part of the reason the literature is hard on 3s is because 3s are hard on 3s. That's part of their transformation work, is 3s are like brutally honest at the end. They look at themselves in the mirror, but when they do, they can really can be stark. So I take it, when she's saying these things, I take it that she's speaking to herself, realizing that your entire life has been a great lie I constructed out of hunger for love and admiration. You'd love to see someone be a little bit gentler there, but I think for her and for maybe 3s, there's actually some healing with that kind of going to the depths of that pain. Quote, I came to therapy with great internal confusion and physically exhausted and tangled in an abusive relationship without being able to leave or recognize it. After 15 years, I woke up. The idyllic dream had turned into a nightmare and a prison. I saw that I didn't really like my life, and I was enormously tired of sacrificing myself and feeling dead inside. End quote. To begin valuing their essence, the person first needs to know it. And here the therapist has to be patient. The sexual 3 may feel like they've got nothing to say. When they look inside, they only see emptiness. That's where the healing begins. There are suggestions around seeing potentially a female therapist for a woman so that the seduction is less present. Recommended exercises. We've got the usual suspects here. I'd love to see more differentiation, but I feel like these are, you hear them over and over again. Reconnecting with the body. Theater, that's a great one for the 3 in particular, right? Because of that spontaneity and learning to kind of bypass the image manager, as it were. Meditation, daring to be authentic, expressing oneself authentically, allowing oneself to express what one considers ugly also helps. So I can really connect with that. Like, probably one of the scariest ways that I could show myself would be ugly for me. And yet as a 4, I dwell in ugliness, so that's what's confusing. Can I solve that puzzle in a minute for myself? So a 4, I'll just say this 4 deals with profound issues of sort of like being bad, ugly, toxic, etc., and deals with that in a bunch of ways. So the story there is available to me, but the actual experience, maybe this is just how things have shifted for me. Maybe it would be a different story 10 years ago, but these days I kind of see through that story more, like how arbitrary it is and how and when and why I might have made up that story about myself. But still, being vulnerable, being sloppy, those feel ugly to me. So I'm like, somebody else would be like, oh, I talk to a lot of people, they have concerns about being too much. If I tell you everything, then that might overwhelm you. I don't really have that. I just feel like that would be ugly. That would be sort of aesthetically unappealing. And so maybe that's just 3 energy there. But it could also be told in a 4 framework, right? Of like, that will they'll see the real me, which is ugly, and leave me or something like that. But for this four, at least, the abandonment is less present than rejection, and rejection is not so bad for being alone as for like being unseen, unknown. That feels a little more fourish. These primal things, abandonment, rejection, isolation, they're all very, very close to each other. So you kind of have to dig in there to figure out what is it specifically. So rejection, of course, is very painful. For the four, not being known is very core for, I think, a lot of fours. For the three, what is at the core? What's so bad about being rejected? I know that I connect with three energy. I connect a lot with being discarded. It's very painful. Like the feeling of being thrown out. But that feeling is still an object feeling. So that still is the feeling of a three who feels like an object. If I take off my mask and express myself as ugly or spontaneous or then what? See, I think the three it's more connected, I think, to like they don't have necessarily another choice. Like, I mean, what we're hearing in this chapter is like threes have to connect with the emptiness. They have to connect with like how little they've developed their real self. She's saying here, first, it's necessary to connect with one's own needs in order to identify what one wants and does not want from others. This allows the sexual three to set the necessary boundaries. She's talking about boundaries, so they no longer feel used. Feeling used. That's used up, discarded. So that's that wounding is very familiar for the three. What the three doesn't know about is being loved for exactly who you are. Just for who you are, what you are. The unconditional love. But the three kind of hasn't had that experience so much in their bodies, at least, in their hearts. So I think it's more of kind of an annihilation, emptiness, destruction, void thing that I would say is like, that's what's so scary. It's not, I'm afraid of being rejected. Of course I'm afraid of being rejected. Of course the feeling of being discarded is unbearable. But I think even that feeling of being discarded is a layer on top of the core void, emptiness that is terrifying, sure, but is also simply just like, I don't know what I am. Complete disorientation, complete not knowing. Carrying on, humility is important for the three, sense of humor. And I find a lot of threes have this humility and humor about themselves, self-deprecating humor in a way, but not in a really beautiful way. The three is the most honest. The healed three will tell you their journey. And this is where the three stuff gets so tricky, because it's like threes can also turn that into a great business, And so it's like, gosh, as a three, we're like, you've got to be so diligent about like, am I turning this into marketing? Has my marketing department taken over again? Because threes will tell an amazing story about their transformation. But if they're clowning around a little bit, if there's a sense of humor, I think that's a really good sign. What a sexual three must come to understand. It is important for a sexual three to understand that nothing bad will happen if they emotionally surrender to another person, if they lose control, if they let go of their mask, and if they show themselves authentically. On the contrary, it can bring immense relief and allow them to build relationships that are deeply fulfilling, ones where they can form a true bond with their partner. Letting go of the need for power in relationships is key. The need for power and control comes from fear. This is where 3s and 8s can it can get a little bit mixed up. And I think it's Naranjo who says that like one of the easier ways is the 8 has that spontaneity. The 8 will kind of unleash their power, and the 3 is more contained. But power and control are of primary concern for both. The sexual 3 must understand that refusing to commit to one person and constantly seducing others just in case something better comes along only leaves them feeling increasingly alone and empty. Okay, so we've got we still have a lot to do. So I'm going to try to breeze through some of these testimonies. I love testimonies, but here, listen to this self-preservation 4 energy. Quote, I confused love with the obligation to endure everything. If I love my partner, I endure them, and by enduring, I receive their love. I think from that quote alone, you can't say whether that's a sexual 3 or a self-preservation 4. Endurance is key to both. But the self-preservation 4 will be more obviously beleaguered, drained. A lot of 4s wear their 4-ness on their face, I would say. I think maybe that's taboo to talk about like faces, but you can definitely get information. I'm not talking about like phrenology. It's just like 4s have, especially self-preservation 4, can be eating themselves from the inside. Whereas the 3's endurance, again, think about Don Draper, there's sort of that stoicism, that forbearance there, but he turns it into his mask. Very tricky, I think, for myself at least. I might have to like try on sexual 3 as a structure for a few weeks and see what I learn. Quote, I felt such desperation for my husband's sexual and emotional rejection that my conclusion was, if he no longer likes my body, it means he no longer likes who I am. I was willing to do anything to win back his love. And in a state of complete disconnection and impulsivity, I went to a plastic surgeon to get breast reconstruction. I was at the peak of my neurosis, of the madness of vanity, where being and body are confused, where giving and receiving love is confused with image. I was convinced that I could win back his love by becoming sexy again. When I started my inner journey, I realized it had been an act of self-harm and an attack on my own femininity. You can see how different masculinity and femininity show up. So it might be the same structure, but really different ways of being in the world. My confidence has always depended on men. I've never known true confidence in myself, only an illusion where for moments I could feel like a superwoman. If a man I was interested in loved or cared about me, then I was valuable, someone worthy. That way I could take care of myself and believe that I truly mattered. If that person lost interest in me, it was a catastrophe. My false sense of confidence would collapse and I would see the truth. That deep down I felt nothing but hatred and contempt for myself because I wasn't able to win or maintain their love. You know, Terry, my wife, is a 2, and 4s and 2s have a lot of material that they kind of collide with each other on. We talked about positive self-image, negative self-image. And the 3 is where they meet, right? But the 3 is also so hard to look cleanly at. So I'm just thinking about my relationship with her, how much my own confidence depends on how she sees me. And again, like some of this is normal. I'm not saying healthy, I just mean normal. 3, 6, and 9 being the core triads, like probably a lot of people feel that way. Like their sense of self-worth, of course, is deeply wrapped up in how their life partner sees them. But also a lot of people would probably say, if my partner stopped liking me, I'd look for another partner. And then even more deeply, right, than that is like, my partner didn't like me, then I would say, like, sucks for them. I like myself. That's sort of where we would like to get to. But whether you're 2 or 4 or 3, it's dependence. It's codependence. It's the codependent triad, 2, 3, 4. Shame triad, heart triad, codependent triad. Maybe that's not fair. I mean, because 8s, 9s, 6s all experience codependency in some way, but it's the home of this heart triad relationship. Quote, now I see the absolute necessity of strengthening what is mine, my home, my work, my way of spending time, that my desires are not just a way to pass the time while I wait for someone to love me for real. I think it's really healthy for a 3, and for any number, but a 3, to do things for themselves. Cook for yourself. Design a space for yourself. Not for the other. Many of these quotes are from women, which is helpful. But I don't want us to forget how different masculinity and femininity are. Quote, in my life, the gaze I have sought most is that of a man, and it has come at the cost of losing myself. In the presence of a man, I have never given myself space to know who I am, what I desire, or what I need. I simply merged with him. I have sought out men who from the beginning showed signs of emotional absence, which required me to exert even more effort to be noticed, as if I were repeating over and over the endless search for my absent father. I was trapped in the crazy fantasy that if I just did enough, the other would stay by my side. So I took on the responsibility of making sure that the presence of the other depended on how well I could be and do things. I sought men whom I idealized for what they represented in the world, because through them, I could build a more solid identity for myself. If I'm with someone who's important, maybe that means I am important too. See, I think none of that really applies to the male sexual 3. Because what she's saying here is the gaze, in order to attract the gaze of a man, I need to lose myself and merge with him and reinforce him, applaud him, be by his side, etc. That's the feminine. That's the feminine idea of the masculine gaze or the male gaze. I think the male idea of the female gaze, there are many, certainly, attractiveness in terms of pure sexual appeal could be one, but safety, right? Women want to feel safe. So that's where I'll be macho. I won't have needs. I'm going to be contained. And I'm going to make her feel safe, make her feel treasured, make her feel like a trophy, make her feel like I worship her. Again, make her feel like, right? Not actually worship her, not actually have her be safe, not actually do these things, but make her feel that way. That's the same goes there, make them feel that way. I think Suzanne Stabile has written, that the 3 is feeling repressed, but they're also feeling centered, meaning that feelings are really primary for them. And I think they're very conscious of how they want to make people feel. And they act from that place, even if unconsciously. But what do they feel? That's blocked. Reclaiming authenticity. Quote, let's talk childhood. I always believed that I had a happy childhood, but later I realized that from a very young age, I was deeply disconnected from myself. Although I perceived myself as a sensitive child, I quickly learned that if I expressed what I felt, I could upset others, mainly my parents, who were always very busy, my mother raising children, my father always tense and working. So I learned not to express my emotions or my needs, and I became very good at controlling myself. I became self-sufficient, a prudent, well-behaved, responsible child with no major complications, but completely alone when it came to emotions. Sometimes I went unnoticed. Other times I achieved success and recognition at school or was chosen a leader in activities, and I loved that, even though I was somewhat shy. Now, looking back, I see that my childhood was filled with difficulties in recognizing what I felt, what I wanted, and what my needs were. I struggled to trust my sensations and my intuition because they were always denied. It was as if I had to feel what my parents wanted me to feel, which is why I grew up feeling immense confusion about what was real for me. I gradually suppressed pleasure and spontaneity. I learned to disconnect from my feelings easily and appropriately because I believed that expressing them would complicate things for others and I shouldn't be a bother. I stopped validating what I felt and began hiding everything I considered not good. I struggled to see the shadow side of things, of people, of situations, of myself. I couldn't see the ways in which I was being mistreated, the dark side of life. I didn't even recognize my own fears. Reading that, I hear a lot for myself, and self-preservation for energy. I also hear a lot there. If I'm trying to disambiguate for a second, like the self-preservation for, there's so much more inner turmoil. I don't think the four loses so much their inner state. They just learn that they have to not be that what that is not okay. But they struggle from that. And so the self-preservation for will explode in anger because this repressed, ignored, frustrated part is still there, saying like, somebody look at me, and then we'll need that contact. The three, it feels like their spiral is toward numbness and emptiness. They kind of just disconnect from their feelings. So I'm feeling a certain way. I'm talking about childhood, as referenced in this quote. This doesn't feel right. I feel like I'm being mistreated. But if I were to feel that fully, then it would complicate things for others. I would no longer be pleasing. And I want to be pleasing. Again, the 9 and the 6, I want to keep everybody together. I want to preserve relationships. I want this to be safe. So very pure kind of motivations there. And so I question my own intuitions. I doubt my feelings. And that confusion, it sounds like the survival strategy for this person over the years goes from kind of confusion to disconnection. Better just to sort of put it aside, put feelings aside. The 4 doesn't really put feelings aside. The 4 buries feelings, the self-preservation 4. Sexual 4, out with their feelings. I think drama has to be present for the 4, even if it's internal drama, even if it's private drama. The 3 doesn't have that drama. The 3 has to be awoken to the drama. Oh my gosh, I did have a tough childhood. Oh my gosh, I didn't experience unconditional love. I want to wrap. I feel better about, I wasn't super vulnerable, but I think I was in contact with some of the core questions I have, at least, about this. And there are a lot of quotes here. But in conclusion, she writes, sexual 3s were children who were abandoned, mistreated, used, abused, beaten, or violated. We were taught to be objects, and our loved ones used us according to their needs. They did not know how to love us for who we were, but only what we did. we became the caretakers of our parents. We were never taught the difference between good and evil, and we learned to disconnect from painful experiences by beautifying them so as not to betray our abusers. We confused mistreatment with love and learned to take responsibility for their actions, transforming them into good people and idealizing them to preserve their image, and by extension, our own. All this left us with very low self-esteem and a total lack of love. We believed we deserved everything that happened to us and assumed the guilt, always keeping a pleasant demeanor, appearing sweet, being compliant, and hiding our strength. Through perfection, we sought moments when we could feel loved and adored, especially by ourselves. Enamored with the idea of love and with being adored, we have drained our lovers and partners, suffocating them with our narcissistic love, demanding a level of attention that no one could possibly fulfill. We sold perfection in order to be loved and demanded that same perfection in return. For much of our lives, we chose partners who despised or mistreated us in order to reinforce the deep sense of worthlessness we carried inside. We endured unbearable situations that would eventually be followed by sweet reconciliations. By tolerating mistreatment again and again, we were willing to pay any price to relive the phase of conquest, where we were once again adored, where we once again became the center of the other's gaze. And for that, it seemed worth it. We continued to protect our original abusers and repeated the same pattern, enduring everything in the name of love. When we began to connect with our inner world, we realized that in our partners, we had been searching for what we never received as children. And as we failed to find it, our frustration and resentment only grew. Our vanity led us to believe that our false love could transform the monster into a prince. Through our healing process, we came to see our vanity and arrogance, how we tried to place ourselves above those who had hurt us in order to maintain our untouchable image of goodness, generosity, and purity. By doing so, we denied them their responsibility. When we finally handed the responsibility back to them, we experienced it as a liberation. At that moment, we began to distinguish what was ours and what was not. And then we were able to begin feeling our pain and our rage. And that rage, in turn, transformed into strength, a strength that allowed us to know what we want and what we do not want in our lives. And in this way, as we begin to find our own power, we stopped handing it to others. Beautiful ending. And we'll finish this project with the self-preservation 3 next time.